Hi, I am Aurelio Cortese from ATR's Computational Neuroscience Labs in Kyoto, Japan. In this presentation, I will be talking about some of our recent work, revealing the exciting possibility that humans may have metacognition of non-conscious neural representations. This talk is part of the Symposium on how can we assess subjective experiences and internal representations in the brain. Most of our brain activity and information processing happens well below the surface of consciousness. Can we actually access these non-conscious representations? How can we record something in the brain, for example, that by definition a participant should not be able to report about? So we'll start by first introducing the technique that we routinely use to access the objective and subjective content of the mind. And I will showcase also some of our work in which we use these representations, but in the context of closed-loop neural reinforcement to modulate participants' subjective experience. And finally, I will present evidence for a role of metacognition in supporting learning of rational choices based on non-conscious neural representations. So our preferred approach is based on fMRI paired with machine learning classifiers, what we call decoders. These decoders, they learn for every specific region of the brain that we may be interested in, a set of weights to maximally predict an experimental variable, which could be participant choices or stimulus characteristics like this orientation here. And the decoder predicts these outcomes from the voxel activity pattern. Now, we like this type of approach because it generally affords a very high specificity. That is, a given condition may give rise to similar overall activity levels, but activity pattern may be different. So in this example of this orientation, similar to a Gabor stimulus, we would have that maybe two different orientations would elicit similar activity levels in visual cortex, but the pattern of activity might be different depending on the orientation. So how do we measure then these subjective experiences, which is what we are interested in the context also of our research and in this symposium? So in the lab, we often use confidence as a psychological construct, and we use it to assess metacognition. So usually the way it goes, we ask participants this question: how confident are you that your choice was correct? And they would give a rating from low to high. The importance of this measure is that it really tracks behavior. It has experiential and the behavioral meaning, as you can see here with this example, in which you have on the x-axis, you have the evidence for one or the other choice, and the y-axis, you have the probability of choosing, for example, the right item out of two choices. Now, you will see that when participants give a high confidence rating, the psychometric curve becomes steeper, so that the choices are better predicted by the evidence. So participants are more likely to make correct choices. And we have found in our own work that frontoparietal areas code decision confidence. So this is specifically, these are a subset of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well as the inferior parietal lobe. And they do, so this area code confidence differently from other behavioral or similar task variables, such as the mere correctness of the choice or the perceived identity of the stimuli. Once we have access to these sort of representation of subjective experience, can we change this experience by modulating these neural representations? This is actually it's a difficult question to answer, but we have, by using this combination of fMRI, online decoding, so real-time decoding of the neural representations, together in a sort of closed-loop reinforcement framework, we can actually do this. So let me explain this a little bit better. So we call this closed-loop neural reinforcement, decoded neurofeedback, as known as DECNEF. because we use real-time decoding and we feedback to participants something about the neural activity, hence the neurofeedback. So in short, what we do is we first build a target decoder. So here it's this computer, let's say, with fMRI and behavioral data from a task of interest. Then in the DECNEF training, so in this closed loop training, the decoder is used in real time to analyze the ongoing brain activity that participants might have in response to some stimuli or thoughts. And we obtain from the decoder, we obtain the probability that this activity really represents our target variable. So this probability constitutes the feedback that we show to participants. Now, in all our experiments, the actual mapping between brain activity and the feedback is not known by participants. So what we tell them, they are simply instructed that they should maximize the size of this disk in order to get more monetary reward. So the size of this disk, we tell them that they can control it, they should change or manipulate the brain activity to make this circle as large as possible, but we don't tell them that this depends on some information that we are decoding at the same time from their brains. And so over time, this procedure allows us to really entrain the brain to generate some activity pattern, or in other words, to associate a reward to a target activity pattern. And we have used this in several ways to modulate perception or subjective experience. And I will give you two examples just now. So the first is a study that was done by Shibata and colleagues at ATR already more than 10 years ago, in which they induce perceptual learning with this technique, DECNEF. So in this experiment, they built a multinomial sparse logistic regression decoder with activity patterns from the areas V1 and V2 from the brain of participants. And participants were viewing those Gabor gratings with 3 different orientations. And so the decoder learned to predict the orientations from the activity patterns in V1 and V2. And this decoder was then used with the DECNEF procedure. So to reinforce a target, the neural representation of a target orientation. For example, the 70-degree. Now, participants did a standard psychophysical experiment before and after the training. And when they compared their accuracy in judging the orientation, here you have in the y-axis, you have the accuracy, here you have different stimulus difficulties, and here you have the target orientation at the center and the 2 other controls. You can see that the accuracy specifically increased for the target orientation. So people became better at discriminating the orientation only for the target and not for the controls. There was no difference in the others. Now we use the same type of approach to manipulate confidence. So we used our decoder that we built in, that I showed you before, that could discriminate high versus low confidence from these frontoparietal regions. And we train participants to induce either a low confidence pattern or a low confidence pattern. And depending on the training that they did, either high or low confidence, their actual ratings in confidence did change. So when they were trained for high confidence, their confidence increased. When they were trained for low confidence, their confidence decreased. Now you will notice that this had no effect on the accuracy of the task, of the perceptual task they were doing. The only effect was on these confidence ratings that they were giving. So we were able to change this subjective feeling of confidence. And more importantly, so besides the fact that we could change this sort of higher order, almost abstract representation, we were able to do so without participant awareness. And I think this is a very important aspect because it really messes a bit the relationship between confidence and consciousness. So really, to give you a quick summary of this first part, so we can measure and change subjective experience. And we can decode subjective states from fMRI activity patterns reliably. If we use decoded neurofeedback, we are able to change these subjective experiences through this combination of real-time machine learning analysis of the fMRI data and giving appropriate feedbacks. And as I said, we can change the subjective experience, but we can do so by passing conscious awareness. So normally metacognition is seen as reflecting conscious subjective experience. And really, it does so in the vast majority of cases. And there's actually quite strong argument even why metacognition itself, or confidence as measured by confidence, is a really good indicator of a conscious subjective experience. But the question as well is it possible at all to have metacognition without consciousness? So to have, in a way, metacognitive access to internal representations that are entirely non-conscious. So we tested this in an experiment in which we put participants in a situation in which they had to make decisions about non-conscious neural representations. And we sort of expected, we hypothesized that metacognition would play a role in this ability, if we could find this sort of a signature of this type of choice of learning. So this experiment, we capitalize on the fact that in DECNEF, by using our decoding approach, we can monitor and detect strong neural representations that are nonetheless non-conscious. So we first built simple sensory decoders predicting perceived left versus right motion from activity patterns either in the visual cortex or in the prefrontal cortex. During the main task, participants were shown a dim visual stimulus. So this is in a different session compared to the decoder construction. So in this new training test sessions, participants saw this dim, very ambiguous stimulus for several seconds. And then they were asked to make a perceptual choice, whether they thought the motion of these dots was more to the right or the left, give a confidence rating on their choice, and finally to make a bet on one of those two actions, A or B. And if they chose the correct one, they would be rewarded. Now, whether the selection of action A or B was correct or not depended on the decoded brain state. So in every trial, we were using this decoder during the time of the stimulus presentation, and the decoder would give us an output, whether the ongoing activity was more likely to be right motion or left motion representation. Remember that the stimulus itself has no information at all. And the decoder output would determine on that trial whether the optimal choice was A or B. So if the decoded brain state was right motion, maybe, and the best choice was A. If the state was L, then the choice was B. This was counterbalanced across participants, and participants did not know of this mapping. So they had to learn this. And you can imagine that this is an extremely complex problem because this brain state is determined by a very high dimensional pattern of activity that is non-conscious, to which participants have no access to. And I will show you behavioral evidence for this as well. So here we're going to look at the probability of making an optimal action or a probability of making a correct discrimination in the task. The optimal action is the one that can lead to reward. The discrimination is simply telling right or left on the noise, 100% noise stimulus. And we can see that here that participants showed evidence of being able to choose the optimal action in those first two test sessions, but they were not really able to discriminate whether it was a right or left state. So here already we have sort of first evidence that this type of learning about non-conscious internal representation can happen, although this evidence here is, you may argue, is quite limited. We actually added to these two test sessions, we added a third control session in which now we translated the neural activity and the decoder output into an actual stimulus motion. to test if participants could consciously learn the rule. And unsurprisingly, this is what happens. So participants become very good at choosing the optimal action, and they can almost perfectly discriminate the stimuli. So the previous relatively small effect on action selection was compounded by a second very interesting finding that I will show you now. So we saw that participants who had better metacognitive ability were also better at learning the implicit associations in our task. So note that here metacognition is computed as meta d prime, and this was computed on data from the decoder construction session, which we called session 0, which is completely independent data. It's a totally different session, different days than the test one on those first two sessions in which no stimulus is presented, but people are still able to bet on the right action. And you can see that those who have better metacognitive abilities are also those that seem to learn better. And this provides a first link between metacognition and learning of non-conscious representations. Next, we also hypothesized that this link between metacognition and learning non-conscious neural representations may exist also during the test session themselves, not just as an overall relation between a general metacognitive ability and performance, but really at the sort of trial by trial level in the task. The plot here shows the probability to choose the optimal action, again, divided by each session that participant did. But now the data, this probability, are further divided for each session based on the confidence that they reported on every trial. So low confidence, 2, 3, and high confidence 4. And you will see here that already from the second session, that in terms of the experiment is identical to the first one, no stimulus information is presented, yet participants are able to choose the optimal the optimal action, and their confidence does track this ability. So on trials in which they are more confident, they actually have much higher probability of choosing the optimal action than on trials in which they have no confidence. So to summarize, in this last study, we used non-conscious brain states to determine hidden task conditions. This is a complex, high-dimensional problem due to the mapping between multidimensional activity patterns and choices, which participants nonetheless appear to be able to solve. Intriguingly, but not unexpected to us, I would say, metacognition seems to index this learning, index this ability to access non-conscious representations, which I think is particularly striking because everything happens non-consciously. Now, we did further analysis on the neural data, finding that this connection between metacognition and unconscious representations during learning is underpinned by the functional coupling between prefrontal cortex, where confidence is coded, and the basal ganglia, where reinforcement learning processes are ongoing now. So overall, we can say that this data sort of supports the idea that people are able to form metacognitive estimates of non-conscious representations, and that with the appropriate techniques, we can recover those representations, and we can actually work on these non-conscious representations. So with this, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. I would also like to thank collaborators and funding agencies, and I will be happy to take any questions, comments, or requests for clarifications. Thank you very much.